So welcome everybody in our Facebook audience, and welcome to all of our participants this evening and our panelists. I'm Ben Pogue. I'm an attorney in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm also a candidate, the Democratic nominee for 9th Circuit Solicitor, which is all of Berkeley and Charleston County. And if you're not from our area, or even if you are, a lot of folks in South Carolina are also not familiar with what a solicitor is, but it's the same thing as district attorney everywhere else. It's the person who's the prosecutorial leader of local criminal justice. And it's a very powerful position with a great amount of discretion and responsibility as to what happens during the criminal justice process. Or maybe what we could say more appropriately, what happens during the justice process. And that's really what our Restorative Justice Forums are all about. They're about discussing justice and our different ideas and different topics that are connected to justice. We've discussed things like in our very first forum, victim empowerment, victim experiences, and understanding what that perspective is like, because we want to put a priority of that on that. We've discussed the intersections between race and justice with a historical perspective, with the perspective of the many other social justice implications that race and justice as an overlap have. And 2 weeks ago, in our most recent forum, we were discussing prison and reentry and the value of formerly incarcerated individuals, also called returning citizens, in creating solutions for us all to see reduction in crime and increases in individual justice, justice for families, for individuals, for entire communities, and ultimately for us all. When we see justice increase for each of us, we really see a better justice system for everyone. So what we're discussing this evening is a really important part of that justice system that has been a topic of a lot of discussion about reform, and it's really about sentencing. So our title this evening is Sentencing: When Does Prison Work and Why? But also implied in that title is the knowledge that a lot of times prison is not the best solution. So what other ways can we design sentencing and the way we punish people, or the way we rehabilitate people or divert people, to make sure that victims are empowered and satisfied and have a good experience, a better experience in their own recuperation and restoration in healing their pain? But also, how do we make sure that offenders are on the right track to make sure that they have a pathway to personal success that ultimately continues to reduce crime for all of us? These are some of the topics we're going to be talking about. And we have phenomenal panelists, both of whom are friends of mine, one from way back and both of you guys are from way back, it seems. Rhett Dunaway is professor at the College of Charleston, was with the Public Defender's Office for 20 plus years, was our public defender here in Charleston. He's got an undergraduate degree from Princeton, a law degree from Vanderbilt, and he's also a member of our community action team and has been a tremendous resource for me. I spent a summer in Rhett's office doing intern work with the Public Defender's Office. And our other guest, Dr. Robert Brown, is an even longer friend of mine. As we mentioned, I still have to call you Dr. Brown, but back in high school, I just called you Bobby. And Dr. Robert Brown is the chair of the Criminal Justice Department at North Carolina Central University. He's got a BA from Hampton University. I've got to go through all these, this litany of degrees that you've got. And then MS from Indiana State and a PhD from the University of Cincinnati. And Dr. Brown's expertise is really critical this evening to our discussion, because he's been a sentencing mitigation specialist for the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, coordinating offender-specific rehabilitation and supervision plans for offenders at the state and federal level. So he's a sentencing expert that we've got in the discussion tonight. I'm going to take us off the gallery view and put us more on a speaker view so you can see who's talking. And I'm going to put myself right in here to start off with, since I'm leading the discussion. So Rhett and Dr. Brown, let's get into it with really the topic question for the evening. But let me preface it. We're going to drop into our chat on the Zoom room and into our Facebook live stream also, little links for you here and there and suggested reading for you, just in case you're really interested in the topic. And one of those articles that comes up when you might Google or do some research is a Time magazine article from a few years ago. And it says 39% of the people who are in prison don't necessarily have to be there. And that Time article says that there's not really a great public health rationale for having those people in prison. So a big part of our discussion that underlies everything this evening is, what are we really doing with our prison system? What are we trying to get out of it? So, Dr. Brown, let me start with you. Sentencing. When do prisons work and why do they work?
That is a really difficult question to answer, in large part because we send people to prison for some multiple reasons. And if you ever heard the expression, if you try to do everything or everything well, you tend to do little to nothing well. So the one thing that prisons can do well is punish people, and that's about it. If the goal is to hold someone accountable to a certain offense in the form of punishment, what some people would call just desserts, prisons can do that well. When we start talking, the other thing prisons can do well, if the rationale for sending a person to prison is incapacitation, timeout, we just want you to be away for a lengthy period of time. I mean, a really lengthy period of time. And that is going to cycle into our discussion about mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing and such. Prisons do a good job of punishing people. Prisons do a good job of removing people from society. When it comes to rehabilitation, when it comes to changing people necessarily for the better, not so much. When it comes to deterring people, punishment for the sake of changing behavior, as intuitively as it may be to think that punishment and for the sake of punishment is going to change human behavior, it doesn't make sense. And if we look at our own lived experiences, I would challenge every listener and anybody who watches this. How many times have you been punished for something? Have you been held accountable for something and you did it again? Or you did something very similar?
Dr. Brown, does this include our teenage years? Because it didn't work necessarily for me.
And I'm going to include those years. It did not work for me. We have this flawed idea that punishment is going to just change people's behavior and you'll stop doing it. You'll stop doing it if we do it harder and more of it. And we use prisons to facilitate that. But in our lived experiences from being children to raising our own children, we should know punishing people does not necessarily make them stop. Some people say that putting people in timeout, people find themselves in prison. We could have a discussion about the difference between becoming rehabilitated versus becoming habilitated in the first place. There are people who make those arguments. In prison or while you were incarcerated, that person gets to slow down and think. Maybe we give a person a skill. But when you understand how we punish and I'm going to use a term, capitalistic democracy. I don't want any listeners to think that I'm trying to launch into a conversation about Marxism or socialism. I want you to think in a capitalistic society structured like ours and in a democracy structured like ours, what is punishment? Punishment comes in the form of financial penalties and deprivation of liberty. Not just short-term deprivation of liberty, but long-term deprivation of liberty. Imprisonment is a part of the short-term deprivation of liberty, and eventually people get out. But prisons are only part of it because we scarlet letter people. We put an F on people's lives, a felony. That's what it takes in order to get sent to a prison. We put them in timeout and in a timeout experience that is debilitating. And when they return to society, in the realm of people who have felonies, people who have done time in prisons are even more stigmatized. And the things that we would think that would change their behavior into always being law-abiding behavior, we make it more difficult for them to get jobs. We make it more difficult for them to be whole in society. Depending on how long they went to prison, where they went to prison, the conditions in that prison, we maybe made what was going on with them worse. If an individual goes to prison and they already have mental health issues, prisons are not a good place to make mental health issues better. Some people go to prison and they do not have mental health or physical health issues, and during their time of imprisonment, those things manifest. So outside of the expectation that prisons can hold people accountable for some sort of offense, and outside of they can be great places of timeout, I'm not going to argue that they do much good.
Yeah, boy, Bobby, I really appreciate that perspective and the added perspective in terms of what people go through after the fact. And Rhett, I mean, a large part of your career as a lawyer has been interacting with folks who are offenders. And a lot of times you see them again and again. So does what Dr. Brown is talking about ring true? You get to know folks. Is prison something that positively changes people? Certainly necessary some of the time, as you and I have talked about, but same question to you. When does it work and why? And what's been your personal experience in dealing with sometimes folks who are offenders?
Yeah, there is a small part of the population, and I'm sort of thinking like, the Frank Nitties, professional killers, who just need to be removed, separated from society. And I think prison is the absolute magnificent answer for that. But that is a tiny little sliver of society. Most of the people that I saw, I did see people who went to prison who had done pretty atrocious things, and they'd be sent to prison. I don't think anyone has the illusion that they're going to go there and come out with a degree or some skill, and they're going to emerge and suddenly going to be your dentist. That ain't going to happen. Hopefully it means they can come out and find a job as a dishwasher with a felony on your record. That may be the best you can hope for. And then they're going to be caught in a cycle of how do you pay these fees and fines and do all this stuff and live in society. And then they tend to go back to criminal activities.
Yeah, well, let me stop you there real quick, Rhett. Thank you for bringing that up. It's interesting that you lay it out like that. You mentioned fines and fees, yeah, and then you're stuck sort of in a situation. A lot of folks do. I mean, there's a myth and a misconception that prisons are like country clubs. You go in there, you get free education, you get free job training, you get all this free stuff, free room and board. Why aren't people better when they come out? But there's little discussion about fees and the damage that it does, and also really psychological damage that environment does as well.
Oh yeah, there are really no positives to prison for the individual who's sent there. And I think that's what we need to sort of differentiate. Sometimes I would see clients who, they may have committed a crime, but that crime alone would not have sent them to prison. But they've had a number of those things. And, the courts will oftentimes say, well, I'm going to give you a chance to prove yourself on probation. Well, that's sort of like saying to a diabetic, we're going to give you another shot at trying to not be a diabetic. That's oftentimes the reason someone ended up in a criminal situation was poverty and trying to pay fees, trying to pay your rent, whatever it is. And that's what led them to it. When they are then placed on probation, there are fees and fines that come with that, which exacerbates the original problem. Now, you sort of see where this goes. It's a never-ending cycle. I'll never advocate for stop putting people in prisons. I do think we need to stop building prisons. We need to recognize them for what they are, which is simply warehousing. There was a time in the 19th century with a much smaller population where, they thought through prayer and rehabilitation, you could produce a better citizen. I don't know whether that was true or not, not having been in the 19th century to be able to report that. My guess is no. But we certainly don't even make there's no hint of that. I would see very thoughtful, caring judges sort of throw up their hands and say, well, I don't know what else to do with you. And these were the people who weren't necessarily a great danger to others, but were just a nuisance. They kept shoplifting, they kept doing whatever. And I don't know what the answer. One thing South Carolina had that was, I think, successful to a degree, they had a work release center where you could stay there, which was a deprivation of your liberty, but you worked in, restaurants or in different places. It wasn't, you weren't on the side of the road cutting grass or doing, it wasn't that kind of institutionalized slavery kind of thing. It was, you were working somewhere, hopefully gaining a skill to pay off usually restitution, money that was owed to a victim. And when you paid that off, then oftentimes your probation was cut off, and then you were done. Well, South Carolina eliminated that program. It was a good program. And it was the kind of thing you could say like, well, I don't want you to go to prison, but you got to make these people whole that you broke into their car or destroyed whatever. That was a good system. Didn't work for everybody, but it was at least an opportunity to give somebody the dignity of being able to work and pay off their expenses and then move on.
Rhett, it's interesting. You use the phrase "make whole," and it seems like you're talking about with that program some degree of at least direct relationship, direct. I'm doing this for that cause and effect that affects and attempts to make whole the victim and victim's experience. We need to put a bigger priority on victim experiences and making them whole. But it sounds like when we get rid of some of those things, our current carceral system doesn't really lend itself to the interaction, the benefits that we're really trying to do. And that's really the big question, that my second question is, what are we trying to achieve with the prison system, and how are we getting there?
I think it has become so a part of us that you almost can't see the forest through the trees. The discussions that are occurring right now, this moment, and that have been occurring over the last couple of years are earth-shattering compared to where we had been. I'd say 4 or 5 years ago, California during the Great Recession, 07, 08, realized they couldn't keep building 2 prisons a year because they financially couldn't do it. 2 prisons a year. So what did they do? They stopped decriminalizing some things. And what do you know? It worked okay. There has to be that seismic shift. And I think oftentimes it's economically driven. And if this is the time, if it's the pandemic, if it's the economic depression or recession that we will emerge out of this in, let this be the catalyst to make it happen. And at least the discussions are there now and people's realization. But I'm telling you, the judges on the bench understood it. They understood. I can think of one judge in particular saying, I just don't know what else to do with you. We've tried this, we've tried that. And I'll tell you something about the restitution center that it didn't like. They were kind of paying for their own room and board. Well, why do that? You don't make people in a prison do that. And here are people who are trying to pay off restitution. What I would rather have seen is part of the money that you earn goes into your account, and part of the money that you earn pays off that victim. And the whole infrastructure that would have been a prison otherwise is paid for by the state. We're paying through tax dollars, and then require, counseling and maybe an opportunity to meet with the victim if the victim wanted to meet with them. There were lots of ways that could have been done. But, these guys felt like a lot of their money went to the institution that they had, quote, the privilege of being in rather than go to prison. That's crazy.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like much of a privilege there.
No.
And Dr. Brown, I want you to weigh on this, in on this also. Rhett was talking about, what are essentially different options. And I think that's something that we lose. It's like from a victim's perspective, it's just, you're confronted with the question, if anybody asks you, which very frequently doesn't happen, what do you want from this experience? But it's either you get to send somebody to prison or you get nothing. It's sort of like looking at it from a health perspective and saying each person who's sick who comes into your office, we're going to use, what do you have? You have a headache? Great, we're going to treat it with leeches. Do you have a virus? Leeches. Do you have cancer? Leeches. You get prison for somebody else that leaves you in the dark. So 95% of people who are incarcerated are getting out. What are we doing with this prison system? Where are the options to try and make it work?
Gotcha. So I wanna say three things. The first one, and this is coming from my most scholarly place. Jails suck. That's a scholarly term. Jails suck and prisons suck even more. We should not expect great things out of places, as Rhett noted, that really don't build up the individual. And I'm purposely bringing up jails because we have to keep in mind some people spend many months in jails, or they go through a revolving door of jails, and jails are problematic custodial spaces as well. In some ways, jails are worse because they are not as well funded, as well supervised. You have people coming and going. You have people who are in jail spaces for very short periods of time because they're being processed and they're going to get out. And then you have people who are in jail because they've been sentenced to jail in multiple months, something under a year. And you have people in jail who may be in the prison system and they're in the jail for a period of time because they're having a court-related matter addressed. So jails,
jails are not counted as prison time if it's detention, unless you go retroactively and you say, okay, now we're going to sentence you to time served, which meant that our time served was actually punishment. But while you're in jail awaiting trial, we're not going to say that that's constitutionally.
No, that's usually counted. It usually is.
Yeah.
And
here it is.
we have to keep in mind when we're talking about, when you see all the statistics about our correctional population, our custodial population, that's including jails. So, jails and prisons. So definitely extending the conversations, jails matter. And again, jails suck and prisons suck even more. Second thing that I want to mention is, and Ben, you touched on this when you led me into this question, they all come back, or just about everybody comes back. We do not execute a lot of people, even though, there's some spaces in our nation where the death penalty is still in use. We really don't execute a lot of people. We do have people serving life in prison, but for the most part, the people that we send to prison, they come home. They come back to communities. And that is another dimension to this, why it is so important.
And
last thing I want to say.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I want to follow up on that one. I want to remind myself to follow up on that too. Go ahead.
And this may be a good connection to that. I want to be really careful, and I think we should be really careful in talking about, in our discussions about how much jails and prisons suck and how bad they are and how they're not good spaces. I professionally know and academically have done research, and I've seen plenty of people who have been able to overcome their criminal justice experience, their custodial experience. We need to be really careful in talking about how bad jails are and what they don't do, and therefore they, when people come out of jails, they're just as bad or worse. We need to make sure that we don't then make the leap or allow others to make the leap that anybody who ever goes to prison is just damaged goods and nothing, and they'll never.
Yeah,
they'll never do anything good, because there are plenty of people who have been able to find ways to overcome the scarlet lettering, the bad things that happen through being imprisoned. So I hope that everyone does not jump on a simple narrative of once you go to prison, we might as well write you off.
Yeah, absolutely. We had some of those guests on in our last forum when we were talking about prison experiences and the value that perspective of formerly incarcerated individuals, returning citizens, plays in both mentoring roles and in sharing what that experience is like. But playing off,
Ben, can I pick up on two ideas?
Yeah, please do. Jump in anytime, Rhett.
What my experience with some clients, and I was there 23 years, so I did see some people come and go, and I represented some of the same people. What seemed like every time I turned around, they were back in trouble. But I did get to see, and it probably takes 15, 20 years to begin to develop someone who went away for a substantial amount of time and then came out and who didn't reoffend. I don't give prison credit for anything other than it was a countdown clock. Sometimes my guess, and this is just me, anecdotal, no science behind it, with male clients, in their late teens and 20s. The brain is still developing. It is nonsense. I mean, they just absolutely the wrong decision on anything. If they can get to be 30 and still be alive, if they can get to be 30 and haven't committed some sort of crime that's going to keep them locked up for the next 40 years, I saw a change in maturity by 30 to 35. And I don't know if it was development of brain. I don't know what happened. Some of those guys went to prison, came out, and were just on the right road. I also saw the influence of people having children. Now, I think there are a lot of people who have children who are not good parents or don't do what they should do towards the children. But I had some clients who seemed to right themselves because of the fact that they were parents. So I'm not advocating everybody have a kid and then, become a criminal and then but that was my observation. It wasn't that prison was giving them any kind of thing other than space to either grow up or get into their own head, get into the Bible. There were lots of different people who do different things, but it wasn't something that the classes that I took at prison caused me to. It was them. It had to come from within. The issue on jail, and you're right, Doctor, thanks for bringing that up. Jail is a whole different animal. And the best, to me, the best understanding of a jail is a bus station. People are coming and going constantly. And it's about as dirty as a bus station. And then, but Charleston County Jail is very well run. And that's my experiences with Charleston County Jail. I've worked in some jails in New Jersey and they were awful. But jails they're not really a society. It is a place of this constant motion. Prison is a society. It's a town, it's a city. And there are people who are in charge, prisoners who are in charge. And that's where you develop all the sort of the things people think about, this guy protects me, I'm in this gang or whatever. We didn't see that in jail. We saw that in prisons. Now, maybe Los Angeles, their jail system could be completely different than Charleston, but the way I think you deal with jails is what has already begun to happen. It began happening in Charleston. It's through bonds, reasonable bonds, low bonds, personal recognizance bonds. If you can keep somebody from going to jail, because what happens? Somebody gets arrested, economically, they're not in great shape. They get arrested and now they're either going to lose their job or they are out of their job for a significant amount of time. Now they can't pay that rent. Now they're thrown out and now they're homeless, facing a charge. It's just, so Charleston County recognized that. It puts people so far behind the 8 ball. Go ahead and write a blue ticket or bring them in with the charge and send them out the next day on a PR bond. They keep their job. They can go back to their family. It doesn't disrupt the whole family. Because that's oftentimes what jail would do. Imagine being held for 6 months, 8 months, waiting for a court date, waiting for a hearing. Maybe you end up with a time served sentence. Everybody wins, except you're off the market for 6 or 8 months, and you come out and you're so far behind. Can you ever catch up? So
yeah, that's a real question. It's almost, so a couple things there. And Bobby and Rhett, I want you to jump in on some of this stuff. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but we've got a few questions there. Rhett, as you're mentioning, even if it's jail time, are we creating almost a public health risk? Are we escalating the probability that somebody's going to do crime just by putting them in that carceral system? Is that an issue there? And the second part, because I want you guys both to weigh on each of these. Rhett, you mentioned simply being in the time, and Dr. Brown, you mentioned this as well, the time spent in prison, sort of sequestering somebody from the rest of society. So when we look at the data, we know that people, maybe because of brain development or something like that, they essentially age out of some crimes. They become less of a threat. It doesn't happen for everybody. And specifically, it looks like it doesn't happen for domestic violence abusers. That's something that we really need to keep an eye on. But what are we trying to accomplish there with really long sentences? And Rhett, you also brought up incarcerating juveniles for really long sentences. Is that time necessary? Are people aging out of criminal activity anyway? And what are we getting out of all this in terms of public health risk, elevated risk, or reduced risk? That's a lot, but jump in, guys.
Well, I think oftentimes, not oftentimes, there are times when judges are influenced by the press, by what's the nature of the crime, and judges have to run for re-election in the General Assembly like anybody else. And if the media is there and you know, I tried to go in front of judges that I thought would had the backbone to do what they thought was right, and I think they generally did. But I think especially a young judge who's just starting out doesn't want to, you know, there is a pressure to, they want to keep their job, they better be tough on crime. In places where judges run for election, popular election, I don't know that any of them can win by, I'll be the lightest judge around, you know, they'll call me the candy man. That ain't going to work. So
Does it work for our society?
No. Well, you know, I don't know what the right way is to select a judge, but I tend to think South Carolina not having popular elections, that's a better thing. I don't know that there is a perfect way. So, you know, I think that influences sometimes these larger sentences. I don't know, you know, I could almost imagine sometimes a judge sitting there and kind of calculating in their mind, how old will you be when you get out based on the sentence that I give you? You know, you can sort of think of that with pedophiles, with some people that are not going to be able to change who they are. And maybe if they get feeble enough, they're no longer a menace. I mean, that may be a calculation that's done. I think that again is sort of in that tiny percent of people who need to be locked up. But, you know, for a shoplifter, for something financial crime, you know, then you're just trying to help Belks or Dillards, you know.
What are we doing at that point, Dr. Brown? What are we really trying to achieve?
So again, remember that issue of we end up sending people to prisons for multiple reasons. There's the, hey, you committed this crime, statutorily, this is the penalty, and we may end up talking about plea bargaining, whatever ends up being the going rate for someone like you, your record, you're going to go to a period of confinement. Somewhere in that window of time, the right treatment is supposed to happen. What we do not do, and this is related to an earlier question, we tend to not recognize that on the punishment side, we have a range, intermediate sanctions. We have everything from, we can hold people accountable financially, or at least attempt to hold people accountable financially for their offenses. We can deprive people of their liberty and bring about punishment through home detention, home arrest, electronic monitoring. And while there are some people who go, well, that's not punishment, I would say for everyone now who's been living with COVID since March, how do you feel being limited to your house just under those restrictions? There's research that shows that there are some offenders who would actually rather do who would rather go to jail and be incarcerated than actually be detained in their homes. So we can bring about accountability and punishment and not necessarily send people off to locked up facilities. We have day reporting centers, we have halfway houses, we can use jail as a sanction, and then we can use prisons. But when we jump just to prison has to be the punishment, that's already shaping the narrative of what's going to happen with an individual. And then you have the side of, why did you commit the crime in the first place? And do we have the ability to provide the treatment that's needed for that behavior? We think that people who commit violent offenses are threats to us all, when violence tends to be a very interpersonal offense, and it tends to be directed to specific people. We do not have a large number of folks out there who are just spinning tops, committing acts of violence on anybody that, you know, is in their line of sight. People get into interpersonal conflicts, in particular homicides, and they're not likely to go out and kill again. Hollywood has done a great job of the psycho killer, the maniac. Once you taste blood, or once you have the thrill of a kill, you're going to do it again and again. Anybody who disagrees with you, you're just going to be a killer. And most people who engage in homicide, that's not their behavior. That's not why they killed someone.
So it sounds like a more nuanced approach of what the crime is and what was behind it is really necessary to the equation.
If we want to change human behavior, if the systems is going to take on a role of not just holding people accountable, we can do that, or in the form of punishment. If we're trying to change human behavior, i.e., we don't want people to recidivate anymore, we don't want people to commit crime, then we have to get to what we know about the individual and the causes or correlates of their deviant behavior, their criminal behavior. Some people, they have substance abuse issues. So we need to do the things to help them manage their substance abuse issues and their decision making. Most people who end up in the system need some form of cognitive behavioral therapy. We need to provide them the kinds of treatment that help them with their thinking and their decision making, their ability to make different choices, recognizing the need to make a different kind of choice than crime, than something that would be a crime, and giving them the coping skills on, okay, I'm getting angry. When I'm angry, I lash out, or someone did something to me. My instinct is to retaliate against them, do the same thing to them, do something worse to them, harm them in some way. We need to engage in treatments that deal with those cognitive behavioral issues. And we actually have cognitive behavioral therapies that work. But
not enough of them.
well, we don't practice them soon enough or often enough. If you go to prison, and this is when I heard Rhett talk about a few things, it brought this back to me. If you're serving 5 years, but we really don't start giving you the treatment that you need until you're close to 2 years toward the end of your sentence, what happened in those 3 years? What types of skills, what type of situations, what type of mindset did one get into, and now all of a sudden you're getting released, so you have to change? Prisoners look different when it's time for them to get released, because they've been worn down. They have to, and depending on if you're in a jurisdiction where there's any early release or parole, you bet you people are going to look different and say different things to get out, but that does not necessarily mean they've changed. And it's not that they're being deceptive, it's what opportunity did you have to change? Most importantly, prisons don't necessarily address the environments from which prisoners come from. You can give me all the coping skills, you can give me all the therapy, you can help me kick drugs, you can help me do a better job of problem solve. I can adjust, as Rhett talked about, in the city known as prison. And I can be a good prisoner in the context of not picking up institutional infractions, not being a problem, maybe even being helpful to other inmates in a positive, law-abiding way. But if there's no reentry plan for me, if there's nothing that's setting me up for success when I'm returning to the community, if I can't be whole in the community where I come out and I have prospects for a job or job training, if I don't have the treatment services, hey, it was great, those therapy sessions were awesome, but if I don't have them when I get back in the community, surprise, surprise, if I'm less successful or less likely to be successful.
Yeah, that's and Dr. Brown, that's really interesting. And I know we've talked about it. We've got folks who are in our Zoom room. It'll be interesting what folks say when we're in the breakout sessions, but who deal with the fact that we have a limited resources as far as housing, education, transportation are concerned for folks before they get into the prison system, let alone for folks once they get out. So one thing I do want to address, because it's been one of the things that we've prioritized addressing throughout our campaign, and one of the things our society really needs to talk about more in these contexts of the situations that people are coming from and going back into when they reenter in the context of something you said earlier. What is the going rate for a sentence for someone like you? What is the effect of racial bias through this system in sentencing individuals and in understanding or addressing the context that people come from and go back out to? And how do we start incorporating that into what solutions we really want out of justice? Both of you, go at it. That's a big topic.
Well, I'm not gonna answer your question right yet. I was gonna throw out something that Dr. Brown brought up that I think is important. What Charleston County has, and what a lot of places in South Carolina has, we need more of, and that's these specialty courts. Someone with a mental illness into mental health court, someone with drug addiction problem, not necessarily a drug selling problem, into drug court. They're very limited in who they will take. Their funding is sort of based on that. The client has to participate, usually has to bring some sort of fee, but they're not reliant on that client to pay for the court. But those have had a lot of success because the people are here. They're still living in their community. They're still living in their situation, and they have an opportunity to remain in their world, but better themselves. And the punishment that they use, you test positive in drug court, you test positive in mental health court, you get sent to jail for the weekend, maybe for a week. That's pain. What's not pain is after you've been so numbed by the whole thing, it's just another day in jail, and then it just becomes, you want jail. If somebody came right now and said, Rhett, you have to go to jail for 24 hours, I'd weep. It would be devastating. But I think after a couple of months or a couple of years, it would just be the new reality. And that's what I see as this hopelessness that comes about. People are getting behind, they're getting into that world, and that becomes their world. And then to go back to prison's nothing. Going to prison should be a big deal. It should be devastating. And it is and it's not, it's become routine.
How sad is that when it's not?
Right. There should be shame with it, and the whole thing the whole society should weep that someone is having to go to prison. And it's just become kind of a rite of passage. Now, the racial thing, I can't say, and maybe I'm blind to it, but I can't say I saw sentences that were more harsh for African Americans versus whites, but I saw a lot more Black clients than I did white clients in a population where those numbers should be pretty equal. Yeah. How they were treated once they were in the system in terms of sentencing, I couldn't tell a difference, but the difference occurred before they ever became a client, of what cars were being pulled over, who was being charged, who wasn't being charged. Yeah. And the county became aware of that when they were part of the MacArthur, and they still are part of the MacArthur grant, in addressing it from the front line, the police line view. And I don't know if it's been successful or not, but they're aware of it and they were trying to address that. And I hope, certainly America as a whole over the last year has been confronted with that. And I don't think it was top of mind in a lot of places, but Charleston County did start to address that a number of years ago in a sincere way, from the highest levels of the sheriff's department, police departments. How successful it's been, I don't know. I don't know the statistics, but they're out there.
So, and one of the things we've talked about is finding our areas of bias, finding where we do have blind spots. And
right.
And Dr. Brown, you've done a ton of research in this area, especially in parts of the justice system that occur before they come to Rhett. What's your take on that?
So when it comes to disparity and discrimination along racial and ethnic lines, and also gender, the intersection of gender, the stage of court processing from the pretrial release decision to sentencing to, if we were to go to the death penalty, that part of the criminal justice system, the racial, ethnic, and gender disparities, the intersection of being non-white, Hispanic, young, and male, when those factors intersect, the likelihood of being incarcerated and the length of the incarceration being longer goes up 4 or 5-fold. If you were to look at the academic research over the last 40 years and going across multiple jurisdictions, we see it at both the state and the federal level. Federal sentencing has some different issues going on due to federal sentencing guidelines, but overwhelmingly, we find racial and ethnic disparities when it comes to who we incarcerate, who we punish through court processing. And it's actually exacerbated by age and gender. It really sucks to be young, non-white, and go and make it to the stage of being processed by courts, to not be filtered out. we could do a whole hour-long panel going through all of that stuff.
Well, it's good. Well, we've got a starting off point for a lot of these discussions, but we do want to open it up to a lot of folks who are participants on Zoom, and we want to get ahead of the Justice Forum that we're going to be doing in 2 weeks. So I'm going to separate everybody into breakout rooms, and Dr. Brown and Rhett, I'll put you into separate rooms and put folks in there. So everybody who's on our Zoom call, you will get a little invite on your screen that says, hey, you can join this one breakout room, and we invite you to do that. I'm just assigning everybody to these rooms. And except for Sam Bellamy, who's going to be a guest next time. So before I open the rooms, the question that we're really looking at is something we've been talking about. And it's this. It's what is it that we want to get from a sentence for an offender? And how do we accomplish that? What do we really want as individuals, whether you're somebody who's experienced crime as a victim, whether you're an offender or offender's family, or just a member of our society who's a layperson, what do we really want out of this, and how do we get there? Is prison the only option? Okay, with that, I've opened up the breakout rooms. Please join and discuss and bring a wealth of perspectives. And as you do, as everybody's jumping into their breakout rooms, I want to introduce my friend Sam Bellamy, who is also a member of our community action team. Sam is really one of the foremost individuals when it comes to our mentoring community and funding for our mentoring community, certainly here in the Low Country, but also statewide. And Sam, one of the reasons that you and I have talked about, you're going to be on our panel in 2 weeks. And the name of the panel, or in 2 weeks, the title of it, I should say, is why would somebody do that? Why would someone do that? Context of grave decisions. So it's really all about decision making. And it's really interesting because Dr. Brown and Rhett both talked about this a little bit. Why do people make the decision to do a criminal offense? And one of the key areas that we really want to focus on when we're looking at public health, when we're looking at reducing crime, is where is the decision-making process for a juvenile? The first time somebody starts to go down the wrong path, make a wrong decision. And it's so critical to have the mentoring community weigh in on these kinds of issues, because you and the folks who you work with in the mentoring community have better connections, better ability to identify when kids are having to make these sorts of decisions and when they make the wrong decisions, and what that decision-making process is like. So tell folks a little bit about what you do and about some of the things that come up as risk factors to let us know a kid might not be in the best position to make really good decisions and might be at risk for other behaviors. What's that like for them?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I'm looking forward to having that discussion again in 2 weeks at the next Restorative Justice Forum. One of my main functions here in South Carolina, I'm really big on providing on-the-ground consulting and training and program development for organizations and individuals, including non-501(c)(3) based organizations that are looking to create organizations and support services to support the young people in their individual communities. So one of our main focuses is really just making sure that individuals who want to work with the youth have the resources and tools that they need to build up the agency and efficacy of their programs and the agency for the young people. So that's kind of my role. My goal is to create a statewide agency, a statewide affiliate that is connected with one of the national affiliates. It's Mentor. It's called the Mentor the National Partnership. It's a federally funded organization that's their main goal is to connect willing adults with children who have a perceived unmet need, closing that mentoring gap. So that's one of the roles that I have here in South Carolina, is connecting organizations to people who have youth that are in need of those connections. You mentioned about just decision makings and things like that. It's funny, Dr. Brown he mentioned cognitive behavior therapy, and that's something that I use a lot with some of the programs that I work with, just in terms of in a very base way of explaining it, it's replacement thoughts. And people have this understanding that if a child or a young person is old enough to understand right from wrong, that they'll automatically make the right decision. And one of the things that I combat that thought with, right? One of the things that I combat that thought with is just this quick example. As adults, we know that speeding is wrong. We see the speed limit when we're going down the road. But if we're late for work, what are we doing? We're speeding past that speed limit, and we know the consequences. The thing that we do that we seem to forget that youth also have the opportunity to do is weigh the risk reward. So sometimes these young people, they're in these environments, they're in these communities, they're involved in different situations where their survival is at stake. And survival could mean different things for different youth. Survival could mean I need to get good grades, because if I don't, when I go home, my parents will abuse me because I got bad grades. Or I'm in a neighborhood that's not safe, and it's more advantageous for me to participate in these criminal activities because all of the other people on my block are doing it as well. So if I want to survive these encounters, I need to do what they do. So we forget that children have those different scenarios in which they have to weigh the risk reward. So if the risk is I might get caught, I might go to jail, as opposed to if I don't do this criminal activity or whatever it is, it could be if I don't skip school, if I don't show up to class on time, whatever it is, I'm ostracized by my peers.
Right, and maybe,
well, depending on my age,
yeah, or maybe you're in danger.
Right, depending on my age, one is going to be more important than the other. So they're going to make those decisions based off of what their perceived risk reward is. And I think that's one thing that we as adults, we often forget. We do it so mindlessly. We weigh the benefits of hitting the snooze on the alarm clock and how much time we have to get up to make it to work on time. We weigh the risk reward of stopping to Starbucks before I get to work. Or if I'm thinking to myself, I'm already late for work, I have no rush now. I can go do whatever I want and just take the consequence for being late, because whether I'm late 10 minutes or an hour, it's the same lateness, it's the same punishment. So we do that all the time as adults. And that's one thing that we don't give credence to when we're working with young people. That they have those same decisions, and a lot of times it's worse because their stage of development it thrives on those social groups, right? So,
and they're under stress.
Yeah,
I mean,
right, absolutely,
worse decisions.
Absolutely. So all of those things play a big role into why young people make the decisions that they make. The real question is, what do we do, right? How do we fix it? Well, the reality is there are a lot of situations that go into a lot of these decisions, whether it's social groups, whether it's health, whether it's family structure, social constructs. All of these things play into what makes up a young person's world. The more disheveled and the more holes and gaps there are in that world, the more work we need to do to fill those holes and fill those gaps. And that gives them more context to make better decisions. So oftentimes we look at it and we're just like, oh, well, this person is old enough to choose right and wrong, but we don't know the gaps. We don't know the holes that are going on in their world. And when you have those gaps and when you have those holes, you have less information to make the right decision. Yeah, right? If you're growing up in a family.
Yeah, Sam, you and I, we've talked about this occasionally before. You don't have the gaps, but also the people who are assessing the people who are making the decision have gaps in their knowledge base about what the decision-making process is like. And you mentioned it. We're going to talk about this a lot in 2 weeks. Perceived risk. You used that word perception. The perception that kids, but also adults go through of what the immediate cost and benefit is. We know from research that we're more loss averse as human beings than we are to, sensitive to the gains that we might make. So a lot of times our perceptions are out of whack, and that is not just present in kids, present in adults too. So yeah, how do we change that? That's a big deal. At the very least, it sounds like one of the things we can be cognizant of those changes. So I'm very excited we're going to be talking about this a little bit more in 2 weeks and get even more of a chance to delve into it. And everybody's back. Great. So thank you, Sam. Everybody can watch, who was in the breakout rooms, you can watch Sam in 2 weeks on September 9th. So Rhett and Dr. Brown, tell us what you heard in the breakout sessions, what resonated, what kind of perspectives do people have?
Well, it was interesting. Yeah, it felt very quick. I don't know how long we had in there, but it wasn't long enough. I think, there was somewhat unanimity on most of what we were talking about. The last most important thing I think we addressed was the issue of victims, and this idea that you can send someone to prison for a lengthy stay, maybe for life, but it doesn't heal anybody's heart. Seen some documentaries. I know that there is some restorative justice in that, even for someone who will never be released. To try and bring some sort of peace back to the family. Like a lot of things, it just takes money. It takes money to do any of these things. But when you start with what it costs to incarcerate someone, you're putting someone away for life. If their life expectancy is 50 years in prison at $30,000 a year, not including inflation, you do that math, $1.5 million.
Wow.
Wouldn't we have been better spending it on education? Wouldn't we be better?
You said it for the rest of us. Wow, that's a lot. Yeah.
And so, all these things cost money, but I don't know what the analogy is about, building a house, but if you just throw paint on it and you don't scrape it down, it's not going to work. It's a massive overhaul that needs to occur. I'm not saying it can't happen. I think it can happen, but it is a long, laborious process. I think I said to y'all last week, where do you kind of put the stake in the ground? Where do you begin? Because it's a generation. If you start now with childhood education and the right food and the right, all the different things, it's 20 years before you see the results. And Americans tend to be looking about 2 months ahead, a month ahead. You have one administration and they put the money towards it. The next administration, we can't possibly afford that. And it's gone. So we're very, we have a very short-term view of everything. And this requires a long-term view. And at any one point that you enter, you have to think about all those other pieces. They all fit together. So where do you start?
Well, hopefully we start here with these kinds of discussions.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Rhett. Dr. Brown, what kinds of things did you guys discuss in your room?
Breakout group, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we spent a good bit of our time talking about the challenges of having family members who are incarcerated. We ended with a quick question that we weren't able to fully get into about dealing with individuals who are abusive, domestic violence, batterers, and what happens if they do not change. Mackie, I sent you a direct message in the chat as a response to that. But mainly we talked about some of the challenges with the effects of people being incarcerated and how that impacts families. And we got there by talking about the increased incarceration and the challenges of incarceration of female offenders, of women. What happens when you're locking up mom?
Yeah.
And
a lot of the women who are locked up are moms. Well, a lot of the men who are locked up are moms.
Yeah. So that's thumbs up. I think that's what we touched upon, and we got personal. We shared some common experiences of being children of system-involved individuals, people who have been in prison. We talked about how there are a growing number of organizations, nonprofit organizations and initiatives that target the children and loved ones of incarcerated individuals. And that is extremely important. We didn't get to talk about it in this way. That is extremely important for reentry and successful reintegration. family is hard enough. I shook my head because so many of us who have been dealing with the togetherness of COVID and our families, or the distance of not actually being able to be with family. Family's not easy. Raising people is not easy. All this stuff is not easy. You then add being a system involved individuals and the many things that come with that. I know I talked about house arrest. It's not easy living with someone who's on house arrest. Not just being the person with the anklet, but being in a house and that beeping and somebody coming in and checking, and you potentially, when a probation or a parole officer coming in, you and your home space, someone asking you questions like you're an offender. It's not easy.
That can be traumatic in and of itself. We're sort of out of time this week. This has been fantastic. The time always flies far too fast. I always want to have more time in the breakout sessions, as does everybody else. But Rhett Dunaway and Dr. Robert Brown, friends and colleagues, thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your wealth of expertise as well. But I think that it starts with these kind of discussions that involve a larger community when we are talking about what works and what doesn't, because we really haven't had those discussions in a very, very long time, especially here in the Ninth Circuit, where we haven't had regular elections for these types of spots. But a big part of it, as if you're watching on the Facebook Live broadcast, is what kind of decision-making and behaviors and interesting contexts, sometimes grave contexts, go into the process of people making the decisions that involve them in the criminal system, but also what goes into the decisions of people who are part of the criminal justice system, like lawyers, like judges, like public defenders, and people who are faced with plea deals, maybe as offenders, victim experiences as well. We're going to talk about the economics of those decisions, the decision-making process, and hopefully give us all a better perspective. And I hope that you all join us. Everybody who is in our panel this evening, thank you once again, Rhett and Dr. Brown. All of our participants in the Zoom room, thank you once again. And thank you everybody to those of us who joined us on Facebook Live. We will see you September 9th for Why Would Someone Do That? The Context of Grave Decisions. Take care, everybody. Stay safe and have a great night. Thank you all once again.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.